Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and thanks for joining us in this second webinar of our Spotlight series, a series where we look at new and emerging and different challenges that might be facing us here in the sector that we work in. Do governments trust communities? How to maintain trust in the age of grievance and disinformation? My name is John Richardson. I'm the Executive Director at the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, and I'm delighted to be your host today. Before we get on, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people here in the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all of the lands of both the Wurundjeri people and also all traditional custodians of the various lands on which you might be joining from. I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the call on this webinar today, and just to kind of recognise and acknowledge the 65,000 years of living with the challenging environment that this continent experiences. There's certainly something that the First Nations peoples can teach us as we face a range of different and complex challenges going forward. Before we get on to the webinar, I'd like to just cover off on a few kind of housekeeping things. The usual sorts of things will be recorded today, and it will be made available along with the slides, and this will be through updates from AIDR, so make sure that you subscribe to our updates from AIDR, and you'll be able to access the recording there in the next one. We'll be using the Q&A function on Zoom to take questions, so if you've got questions, please use the Q&A box and not the chat. Questions can get lost in the chat, and we'll be looking sort of at the Q&A box to sort of frame up any of the questions that we want to ask our panel at the end of the presentations. You're going to be able to update questions by clicking the thumbs up, and I'll certainly do my best to ask as many of these questions as I can, but sometimes we have many questions, so we're not always able to get to them. Use the chat window though to share any thoughts that you might have. We find that this is a great way of engaging with the content and sort of having a conversation in the background. So we certainly encourage that to happen. I do want to remind you just to be respectful to each other when you are using the chat or the questions, and to be respectful to our presenters as well. Just finally, I just want to also be aware that some of the content that we might discuss could be distressing for people and bring up prior experiences. In that instance, please use any techniques you've developed to help you manage any adverse reactions. So the housekeeping out of the way, let's get on to the main game. Governments have been around since the Sumerians and the Egyptians, providing a range of cooperation to tackle challenges and deliver services that we as individuals are not necessarily capable of doing on their own. People turn to their governments in crisis, and we've seen that repeatedly in recent years, be it the Black Saturday bushfires, Queensland floods, Black Summer, or COVID. Since 2012, the National Strategy for Disaster Resilience, our sector has talked a lot about shared responsibility and what that might mean. As Mark Duckworth says, it might be shared, but it's not necessarily equally shared. And some areas have more responsibility than others. Some, such as governments, have larger levers they can pull for change than individuals. But what does this all mean when we know that the challenges ahead of us are increasingly more complex? Fortunately for us, we have Mark Duckworth, who has peered into the minds and eyes of governments for at least a couple of decades, and he's been grappling with these questions, particularly sort of looking at it from a government perspective. Mark is a co-director of the Centre of resilient and inclusive societies at the Deakin Institute for Citizenship, Globalisation, and it's also a senior political advisor to the Faculty of Health and Deakin at Deakin University. I have worked with Mark many moons ago in the Victorian state government when he was also then Director of Security and Emergencies for the Department of Premier and Cabinet. So I'm going to step out of this and hand over to Mark to talk to us about building trust, social harms, disaster resilience, and do governments trust communities? Over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, John. It's a great pleasure to be talking about these issues with you today. If you ask the question, why is this important, as the next slide shows, trust is the glue that holds society together. And without it, society fragments and falls apart. Turning to the next slide, we'll see that I'm not just making up what I'm talking about. We've done a couple of research reports, which include not only literature reviews, but also in-depth interviews with people in government, in emergency management, and in communities. Now, as the next slide indicates, trust is a slippery concept. A lot of the greatest minds of the last 50 years, Anthony Giddens, Francis Fukuyama, Robert Putnam, and others have written about what trust is. And it's the next slide I have has a stab at trying to define it, because it's based on emotion, it's based on experience, it's based on the evidence that individuals have, and it requires a reciprocal relationship between parties. The number of key characteristics: predictability, reliability, confident expectation of future action, and being vulnerable. So essentially, when I say I'm going to do something and I do it, and that enhances trust, and if I don't do it, then that breaks trust. Anthony Giddens calls trust a protective cocoon. It really something that surrounds people and can make them feel safe, that someone else, some other individual, an institution, government is actually going to do what they said they were going to do, or based on what their past actions been. But it's also involves people opening themselves up to a degree of vulnerability. It's a way of people as social beings dealing with risk, uncertainty, and complexity. But that protective cocoon can sometimes fly apart when someone breaches that trust, and individuals, companies, and others know that trust can vanish in an instant if in fact they act in a way which breaches trust. Looking at the next slide, I want to also comment on the fact that when we talk about trust flows through different ways. It flows vertically between governments and institutions and communities, horizontally between individuals, but also, as I say, involves this element of reciprocity. The other thing which I just want to mention in the next slide is when we talk about what is the community that we're talking about, because when we say, do governments trust communities? Well, there are multiple communities. In emergency management, we often focus on geographical communities, but there's so many other types of communities. And I think it's one of the things we need to focus on more in the emergency management sector, how these different types of communities exist: communities of interest, communities of identity, communities of circumstance. Often in emergency management, people are thrown together, but online communities, and increasingly people live their lives online, and that's where their community is. The other thing is government agencies are also communities with their own cultures as well, and sometimes that's one of the things that has an influence on these relationships of trust. The next slide will make the comment that trust involves a risky investment. And I think this is one of the things which I'll come back to, is why sometimes government institutions have difficulties in building trust with communities, because it actually does involve a risk. Because as I indicate here, to trust someone is to expose yourself to the possibility of betrayal. But the alternative to trusting others, in fact, means that we can't build social relationships, which are so fundamental. The next slide, I also talk about one of the big problems that governments have, not only in Australia, but around the world, what's been called the trust deficit. And it varies from government to government and country to country. As we know, in the United States, it's particularly bad, but in some other places, such as Australia and Sweden, it's not quite as bad. The next slide is quite a strong illustration of the Pew Research Centre's trust surveys from 1958 to 2021, which shows public trust, and this is the US federal government, has really declined. There are moments when it goes up, it goes down again. We saw, interestingly, during COVID, in the first year of COVID, trust in government shot up again, when we were all in this together, but then it went down again, and it remains not only in Australia, but other Western countries at a relatively low level. Because as the next slide shows, we now have a trust crisis. The Edelman Trust Barometer in 2022 say that the world is ensnared in a vicious cycle of distrust fueled by a growing lack of faith in media and the government. And the consequence of this disinformation and division is that people are seeing, and we're seeing in particular in other parts of the world, this trust and lack of trust in government is being exploited for political gain. Looking at the next slide, is the 2024-25 World Economic Forum Global Risks Survey. And it's important, if you think of the World Economic Forum, made up from leaders, from political leaders, heads of a lot of the major corporations around the world. A whole lot of things indicate that number one, misinformation, disinformation; number two, extreme weather events. Then you have social polarization, cyber espionage. Then among those top 10 include inequality and number 10, erosion of human rights. And in 10 years' time, most of the issues are ones that many people on this webinar deal with on a day-to-day basis: extreme weather events and so on, and critical change systems, but also inequality and social polarization are still up there. So when, if one looks at the next slide, there's a quote from the Edelman Trust Barometer of this year about Australia, which says, Australia has slipped into distrust territory with a profound global shift to acceptance of aggressive action and deepening fears, giving rise to a widespread sense of grievance. And one of the really big issues around grievance is it's one of the things that fuels extremism, including, for instance, the rise of the sovereign citizen movement. The next slide, there's another factor which is important, which is that trust is not equally distributed across all communities, that different communities have different levels of trust in government, and likewise, research has indicated that government officials trust some communities more than others. And this is a particular problem, as the wealthy and well-educated have higher levels of trust than more disadvantaged groups. And part of this is because well-educated people and people with greater incomes often find it easier to navigate the systems of government. So for some communities, distrusting government appears to be a rational choice because they in turn feel that government doesn't trust them. The next slide is an illustration from the Edelman Trust Barometer of what they call the trust gap in Australia, that the level of trust in government by the informed public, what they call the informed public, was at 77%, but by the mass population, which is their term, which indicates people with lower education and lower income, the trust index indicates a much lower trust. So there are two trust realities in Australia. And this is important for people in the emergency management field, because that growing level of distrust, and if you see the next slide is the most up-to-date figures, that in fact the growing levels of distrust as they what Edelman calls high income and low income people, the top 25% and the bottom 25%. Australia is in that red territory. One thing that has happened in between 2022 and 2025 is that even the people in high income have actually slipped down into the neutral rather than the high trust area. So levels of trust more generally in Australia are actually in decline. The next slide, I think, is one of those things that, again, that this path of polarization is driven a lot by things that are happening in other parts of the world. But one of the things that's happening, which is particular concern to us in emergency management, is that a significant number of people are not trusting information from government or the evidence of experts. And this is a particular thing that is of concern. The next slide is a headline from the US early this year, July, where there were the big floods in Texas, and this from the CBS News. False claims link cloud seeding to deadly Texas floods despite zero evidence. There were some widespread views that, in fact, the floods were caused by people cloud seeding, and it was a deliberate thing rather than actually caused by what was happening in the weather patterns. But when there's a significant number of people who are willing to believe, despite zero evidence, some things that are completely false, these using what some people term alternative facts, then that's a really big concern. So as the next slide, Australia is part of this post-truth world. Disinformation is increasingly difficult to challenge and refute. We see this happening in Australia, and this decline of trust and confidence in government and institutions, increasing conspiracy theories. And one of the other things which is evident is that there's some clear gaps in critical and media literacy, resulting in incapacity to properly analyze and assess information, so that they're unable to determine the difference between what is an actual fact and what is an alternative fact. So as the next slide, the World Economic Forum says, we know that trust is a must, so that around the world, leaders are really concerned about this. They talk about the epidemic of misinformation, widespread mistrust of social institutions, and this divide is widening. Without that trust, we can't actually solve the issues that we're dealing with today. So as the next slide's heading is really saying trust is a two-way street, that one of the reasons community trust in government has collapsed is that government often don't trust communities, because as I was indicating before, and as the next slide illustrates, the trust must go both ways. There's been a lot of work done on the question of, do communities trust government? But the reverse question, do governments trust communities? And if not, why not, is rarely asked. Now, the next slide raise again this issue that trust is based on reciprocal interpersonal relationships. And it requires that those reciprocal relationships to maintain and build trust between government and communities. But trust is made or broken by behaviors. If the way agencies or employees act, if that does not create trust, their policies won't work. And one of the key messages that I have today is that government agencies need to be aware that how they do things is important as what they do. The behaviors that need to develop in trust include reciprocity, reliability, transparency and openness, vulnerability, accountability, responsibility, respect, confidentiality, and empathy. And the next slide, which was taken from one of our reports, is indicating these behaviors and processes around building relationships, expanding familiarity and awareness of communities, increasing cultural competence, communication and constructive collaboration are all vital to actually building those levels of trust. So the next slide is taken from a document from 2011 by FEMA, which says how that trust is a recurring theme that underpins healthy and strong communities. It's the glue that holds different groups together. And building social trust requires more than conventional outreach on trust issues. It requires collaborating with communities in joint activities designed to address specific local problems. And this is from the document, A Whole of Community Approach to Emergency Management. The next slide is something which is important, that trust is also core to resilient communities. Over the last 20 years or so, disaster resilience, community resilience has been one of the core themes in emergency management. And this was clear back in the National Strategy for Disaster Resilience from 2011, talks about the need to empowering individuals and communities to exercise choice and take responsibility, and that it required the availability and accessibility of transparent, accurate, and trusted sources of information. So it's been recognized for a while that it's core to resilience. Now, the question which you might ask, and the next slide asks this question, why is trusting difficult? And the discussions we've had, this issue around hierarchy and control, that relationships of trust may challenge traditional structures. Government policies and programs are often done to communities and not developed with them as partners. Another thing is that trust building is as a lot of things which are less tangible is difficult to cost. How do you cost investment in, how do you actually understand the cost benefit of investment in social capital? Investments in physical capital are a lot easier to see and calculate. As one person leading New Zealand emergency manager said, you can't take a picture standing in front of avoided costs. And it sometimes is not seen to be such a priority. The other thing is that for some government agencies, trusting communities is seen as risky, because if you get out of control, you might lose control of the narrative. Governments may have particular priorities and aims, and communities may have aims that conflict with that. And so there's issues around that. However, from the community point of view, and the next slide, there's something which I heard from a community leader, which says, sometimes writing grants is not our strength, but delivering for communities is. And I think that one of the elements is that government processes may suit government, but don't always suit communities. The next slide looks at some of the things that need to be done. Governments need to invest time in development and maintaining a relationship. Some of the things we've heard which undermine trust include frequent changes in personnel. There may be multiple good administrative reasons why people change every few months, but we've heard quite clearly that when people change on a frequent basis in, say, in emergency recovery activities, that communities then have to start again with a new person. There's also the need to understand the internal diversity within communities, and the need to understand that before disaster happens. The other thing is that, the more senior a public servant becomes, the more time they spend with ministers, the less time they have for communities. And some of the feedback which we've heard is that some communities see the relatively junior level of officials given responsibility for community engagement, as well as the frequent changes in personnel, indicate that maybe some agencies don't see trust building as important, or even that the community is not seen as important. So this is some of the often quite inadvertent consequences of government action. The next slide talks a bit more about this issue about risk-taking and vulnerability. And I think it's one of the paradoxes that we have, and having reviewed and been involved in developing many emergency management policies, things are filled with around the communities, the center of what we do, talks about empowering communities, but you can't empower community and also control the process at the same time. So there is an element of risk-taking, And I think this is one of the chief challenges. However, developing mutual approaches to shared power that acknowledge the vulnerability inherent in this for both communities and government is likely to produce some results over time. So what can be done? The next slide, we ask that there needs to actually be some methods done to focus on agreed ways to build and maintain trust, and avoiding those breakdowns in trust. And clearly, governments are better resourced and need to take time and efforts to move away from some traditional top-down ways of working. And I think, as the next slide illustrates, part of this, if you say, well, what can be done? One of the things is that there's often little training in how to build a relationship of trust. One of the things that we were told quite clearly is that, for instance, if people working in international aid, they spend a lot of time learning how to work with and understand communities and building that level of trust before delivering any program. But this type of tradecraft in trust building is something that public servants are not actually trained in. So there needs to be training on building and strengthening trust, on building and maintaining relationships, expanding the familiarity and awareness of communities, greater awareness on cultural competence, establishing some communication strategies that actually keep people informed, and developing methods for constructive collaboration. If one looks at the next slide, then I think one of the key things is that, which we had a lot of complaints about, is the nature of the grant process. The process and design of programs should promote innovation, be done with communities, not to them. And one of the constant complaints is around that communities post-disaster often need to compete with other communities for grants. Application processes are very complex, and often the accountability requirements are in fact enormous compared to the actual size of the grant. And there's often so many conditions placed on a grant that, in fact, the grant has ended up focusing on achieving government outcomes rather than meeting community needs. Now, there have been some innovative things put in place in the last few years to try and make the grant and funding processes more transparent and more open to communities. But it's one of the things which often there's complaint about. Certainly, taxpayers' money, there has to be proper accountability for it. But the question is whether, in fact, that those accountability mechanisms are actually too onerous, given the size of the grants, and too restrictive in terms of community needs. That you have this conflict between wanting to give communities agency, but also having strict control over the funding requirements. The next slide covers the question that communities can help improve trust by some of their actions, but one of the things is that government may need to provide resources to allow communities to deliver on their own priorities. And this it comes around the question of both providing training for communities in issues around governance, but also investment in capability building. And that's fundamental, because often communities, as we know, they're giving their time free of charge, and they're concerned that that people seem to think that community time is free, but in fact, people have businesses to run, they have jobs to do, they have their own lives, and there needs to be a better understanding about that. But certainly, communities can do more in this space, but it does also requirement about investment by government in building social capacity. The next slide covers what governments can do, showing through actions they value community experience, that community empowerment agency is real, providing resources, time and funding for relationship and building, delivering on promises, and if for some reason a promise can't be delivered, being transparent about why the promise isn't fulfilled. A focus on longer term policy outcomes. One of the things which we've heard is that making announcements and immediately, so our discussions with the communities going on, undermines trust. Cultural competency, increasing that we mentioned before, and limiting personnel turnover, or where that's not possible, making sure that there are good processes in place that enable the relationship of trust survives the change in staff, and increasing the trust building activities. The next slide we'll also look at this issue around co-design and co-production. A lot of documents talk about co-design, but full co-design is not, it's not just a fancy word for consultation. It's not that governments devise a process and then consult communities on it. It actually means that responsibility for the design of the service and responsibility for the delivery of the service is in fact shared. And while there's a lot more understanding of co-design, and there's some good examples across government, in particular in the health sector, where there've been good co-design, often the government policies which talk about co-design are not actually carried out in practice, because of there isn't this, in fact, this full sharing doesn't take place. So looking quick, I'm going to run through a couple of things in the next few slides. We developed, as part of our report, what's called some principles and guidelines and a trust checklist. This checklist has been used, for instance, in the Australian Multicultural Review, and as a means of guiding government involvement with multicultural communities. And a lot of this talk just builds on these things and asks people some questions. You know, are your behaviours as a government official helping build trust? Have you asked these questions? Have you thought about these things? And the next slide talks about the issues around communication, collaboration, and the importance of those. And the next slide, talking in particular about some of these key concepts of reciprocity, reliability, transparency, empathy. Empathy is such an important thing. Accountability is important, responsibility, respect, and confidentiality. And all these concepts, which we've summarized in these 3 slides, and they are, you can read them in the report in a lot more detail as an appendix to the report. The reason that we've had them, we've tested them, we've spoken to community groups and others about what are the questions that you want people in government to ask, and this encapsulates some of these. So the next slide outlines some of the key things for people in government and emergency management to ask themselves. Are relationship building efforts and activities well resourced? Do government agencies and decision makers allow sufficient time to build and sustain relationships? What strategies are in place to reduce the impact of staff turnover? And how can government agencies better respect and accommodate the time pressures and commitments of community members? And my final slide includes a quote from a document called Towards a Theory of Government, which talks about reciprocity is key to the power of networks, exerting a governing logic over them, the alchemy of mutual give and take over time, turning to a golden trust. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Fascinating tour through this such a complex concept around trust, and I think it's like it is something when you think about we throw the word around so readily, and I think that's, you know, it's one of those things that is in the vernacular, and then when you actually, you know, you start to unpack it and realize, you know, that so much of what we do is based on this concept, and it's not straightforward. And I think this is the thing that I think I've certainly grappled with over years working in this space is that ability to gain somebody's trust, and not just gain it, but I think maintain it. I think that's a critical part of this work. Given even if we're thinking about pre-disaster and how do we build resilience and reduce risk, we have to gain the trust of people to engage and be involved, and then right through that long the long process of and long dynamic process of recovery. We still, I think, continue to forget that the recovery is it's not a matter of days and kind of weeks and even months. We're talking about months, years into decades. And so how do you kind of maintain trust through that? I'm going to now invite my colleague, Dr. Mayeda Rashid, to provide a response, some considerations and a response to what she's heard from Mark's fabulous presentation. So over to you, Mayeda.
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. And thank you, Mark, for a fantastic, and let me be honest, very trustworthy presentation. I think we can all trust what we have just had. You have given us a lot to think when it comes to trust, especially how it's not just nice to have, but really the glue that holds our communities, societies, and institutions together. I love how we describe trust as something that flows, not just up and down, but between governments and communities, and sideways too, between people and groups. It's dynamic, and it's built on our relationships. What really stood out for me is how trust is not just about politics when it comes to government and programs. It's about behaviors, things like reliability, transparency, openness, and as you emphasized, empathy. These are the everyday actions that can make or break trust, and they are just as important as strategy or framework. Your point about the trust deficit, the growing level of distrust in Australia, really struck me. We are seeing more people feeling disconnected from government and institutions, and that's a big challenge for all of us working in disaster risk reduction and community resilience space. When trust breaks down, it's not just a political issue anymore. It affects resilience, community safety, and even how we respond to disasters and our mindset to community resilience. I also appreciate the reminder that trust is a two-way street. It's not just about communities trusting government, it's about government trusting communities as well, and being willing to share the power, listen, and sometimes even taking some risks. That's not always easy, but I understand it's essential if we want to make genuine partnerships and want to see real outcomes and impact. In our work, we see every day how important it is to invest time in building relationships, not just ticking boxes, right? Building trust takes time. And as you said, it takes vulnerability from both sides. Sometimes that can mean letting go of a bit of control and being open to new ideas, even they may not really fit into our plan. Your call for more training in trust building, I find it's really, really important because it's a skill and it's something we can get better at together, whether it's through co-design, of course, right co-design, better communication, or just spending more time with people that we work. Every step we take to build trust makes our community stronger and resilient. So thanks again, Mark, for sharing a light on this. Trust isn't easy, but it's absolutely worth the effort. I would say let's keep working together to build it. Maybe one relationship, one conversation, and one action at a time. But let's go there. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Mayeda, and a great, fabulous summary of also a great presentation, and I think distilling it down to sort of where we might be able to go next. So we're really fortunate. We've got a few questions here, so I'm going to start. I'm going to start with Arana's question, which I think is a fabulous one. Again, thinking about the context in which we are all working. So they've asked, have you noticed a high level of distrust from communities that experience frequent emergencies, i.e. repeat flooding events?
Well, I haven't researched that in particular, but I think that one of the things that happens, interestingly, is that you can create a higher degree of what I call horizontal trust in communities, that trust between the community members who have suffered repeated events, because they've actually built that sense of community and connectedness, and so it's one of the things that's said about disasters, that they can actually build on the strength. They build on the strengths, but also seek out the weaknesses. That in some cases, you can actually build higher degrees of trust, but in other communities, which already there may be some fractures in those communities already, a series of disasters can actually exacerbate and cause more social division. So in many ways, the pre-existing state of the community and the levels of community strength can often be one of the factors that determines what happens afterwards.
Thanks, Mark. And Mayeda, have you any thoughts on that as well?
Mark summarized it very well, but sometimes from my experience when working in Bangladesh with flood-affected community, I found there are lots of distrust from the community, and when community works together, they build so much strength and resilience. Sometimes in Bangladesh context, I found they don't even think about like government support. They think like community can help each other, and they trust each other more than government.
I think one other brief thing I might mention is that it goes back to thing we speak about a lot in terms of relationships with government, is the amount of resources government provides to prevention and mitigation. So if after one disaster money is put in to deal with mitigation, that can help build trust. But if there's a feeling that in fact the money isn't going to the mitigation or the prevention, then that can and communities that suffer multiple disasters can feel that in fact that their local needs are not actually being taken care of by government. So that's another factor which I think is important.
That's actually a kind of a nice segue into, hopefully I can pull this question together, because it's a combination of two. So one from Ella, who works in risk reduction, and then Deb Orsos from Canada. And I guess this is like, so Ella's talking about that she works in risk reduction. Do you have practical suggestions on how governments can kind of reframe their ways of operating to reach and build trust through time, given that people, a lot of the people who are engaging in risk reduction and resilience, have other pressures in life. And I think this links to Deb's question, which said, governments offer grant programs that may have a rolling intake or a longer deadline for submission. So yeah, it gets the focus on the practicality of how do we kind of change government deadlines. Might be a short way of
I think one of the things is to focus on investment in social capital as well as physical capital. And this is one of the things that gets raised quite a few times, is that we see, post-disaster, a lot of money goes into building community capacity, various community recovery committees and so on, and that's important and that's great. But then a few years on, the money goes away. And we've known this for a long time. And I remember it was one of the key things in the National Strategy of Disaster Resilience when I was involved in talking to many communities and governments after that, and that's 15 years ago. We recognized that you actually needed to build that and invest in that local capacity, and you actually needed to put that money in, which is not an enormous amount often compared to physical infrastructure, but we tend not to do it. We tend to put a lot of money in to communities post-disaster to actually build that ability for communities to deal with the recovery process, but that money needs to go in beforehand. And now there are cases, in clear cases, in which that happens, and some local government areas have done a really good job at doing that. But across Australia, it's somewhat patchy. And so some communities end up having really good social capacity, and others don't. So I suppose that's one of the key things that needs to be looked at. Another thing, and I go back to this point about the grant process, and I've heard this even the last few weeks, is see the way in which the grant process, which is, government grant processes can be designed for all sorts of good purposes. You need competitive grants, you need to apply, you fill out the form, and so on, and that, and for many reasons, in certain cases that works really well, but it often doesn't work well post-disaster. I think that's one of the challenges that we have here, is that we have mechanisms that actually mean that some communities feel locked out of processes because they're just too complicated and onerous. There was another part to the question too, which I don't think I answered.
Look, it is also, I suppose it is the deadline. So are there examples you're aware of where there might be sort of more flexibility or kind of rolling deadlines in grant processes?
Well, I do know that there's the one very good initiative was done in Gippsland after the 2019-20 fires, with the East Gippsland Community Trust was set up and given several $million by the government, and then had more community focus. So it wasn't, it still had a whole lot of strict, accountability mechanisms around it, but it actually permitted more local initiatives, and communities felt that they actually own the process rather than it being going into a government process. So there have been a few innovations that have actually received a lot of community support in other ways of meeting government accountability requirements, but also allowing community need to be focused on. So there are some ways forward that could be rolled out more generally.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Mark. Mayeda, and got some thoughts as well?
Mark said it well. I will just add one thing. Like, as Mark said, our common practice is more focused in recovery. The funding goes there, and also, I feel like if program design and focus more on not just the vulnerability, but the capacity that this community has, if recognizing those capacity and in capacity building activities, acknowledging that and focusing on which capability already has, it work better in impact, and then it also helps building trust in return.
Yeah, so true. Yes, and I guess this kind of leads into the next question, which I'm going to ask, which is, so I think those of us who interface directly with communities understand well the necessity of investing time and energy into building relationships over long periods of time. They work that. The issue that their team runs into, particularly as a response agency, is convincing their executives of the value of this kind of long-term investment. Do you have any tips or ideas on how to communicate this with those with the power and resources to allow us to engage meaningfully and not just in the mad rush before the election cycle?
Well, I think one of the things is I mentioned avoided costs, and it's sometimes difficult to calculate them, but you can illustrate, and we know, people in the emergency management world know the figures have been around for a long time. The amount of money, if the amount of money invested in prevention, can produce the 10-time results in terms of having to deal with response and recovery. But the money just doesn't put in there. For instance, if according to that Deloitte figure, natural disasters, or disasters whether they're natural or not, but disasters cost us $37 billion a year, that means we should be actually investing $3.7 billion a year in prevention and mitigation. And I don't think we do that. So I think, and so there's lots of figures out there, but it is a question, I think, of using some of the treasury tools that exist, and often used quite effectively in, say, in the health sector, because we know, and John, you'd know this from your time in the health sector, is that when we talk about preventative medicine, that has a lot of weight in terms of, one can think of the billions of dollars of savings that have come to Australia through the effective, widespread, childhood vaccination regimes and things like that. We can cost that, and you can actually, there are mechanisms that we could put in place to actually cost some of these investments as well. But I don't think we've, in the emergency management sector, haven't put as much time into some of those tools and that type of economic analysis, because it exists there as well. Likewise, if you think of the road safety, I mean, you can actually cost the savings from mandatory seatbelts. Now, there were some people who, back in the early 70s, who resisted this and say, this is infringement on my individual rights and stuff. But you say you can find some other areas of public policy where these types of economic analysis has actually been effective, and I think we need to do a better job in the emergency management sector of convincing treasuries about the fact that those avoided costs are real and enormous.
Yeah, so true. All those costs, it can be used on other things, and I think that's one of the things we tend not to talk about. The $37 billion you spoke about, Mark. I mean, I think that's kind of equivalent of around about the federal education budget. So think about what you can actually do with that. Mayeda, any thoughts tips from your perspective?
Really, I think, yeah, Mark said it all there.
Okay. Can we squeeze one more question in? Let's try and go one more. Volunteer agencies often promote members as trusted voices of their communities, often basing decisions on this thinking. Do you think volunteers reflect or represent their communities, or are even trusted within communities due to links to government agencies?
Well, I think volunteers often do have significant trust in the communities if the individual's well known. I know that but also there are other voices as well who are trusted voices. So it may well be, for instance, the local GP is the trusted voice. And I think that one of the things which we've done a bit of in government, but probably should do more of, is actually understanding who are the trusted voices in the community and who that when people say something, they're going to listen to it. And I think that's just having a being a volunteer and putting on a uniform from time to time doesn't remove all trust. In fact, it probably is actually a very helpful means of actually having community members who are seen to be in these positions. There are some people, and I think that this is I touched on this, and I know that's actually one of the reasons why this issue also has a kind of a real life issue as well. I know sovereign citizens have been in the news a lot, but I think that one of the key things is that there are some people in our community, because of this rise of misinformation and grievance, who actually do not trust anybody wearing a uniform, and we actually probably, in addition to the training which I'm talking about in relation to trust building, we probably also need increased training for people in the emergency services sector in this this growing numbers of people who don't trust any government information or agencies at all, and there's some, as you know, some potential dangers in that for individuals.
Thank you, Mark. I think we might have to leave it there. We've still got a couple of fantastic questions, but I think just so I can get you back into your day jobs, we shall probably draw it to a close. Join me in thanking Mark for giving us a fabulous, fantastic and interesting presentation, which I've kind of first heard. I've been sort of heard a lot of Mark over the years and been part of the research, but certainly heard this all come together at the NHRA forum at Adelaide earlier in the year. Also want to thank Mayeda for coming in and giving thoughtful perspectives on what we've heard. Also, I'd just like to thank the team here at AIDR, Ange Draper and Charlotte Fell, for their work behind the scenes to make this all happen and run really, really smoothly. They make us look exceptionally good. I'd like to acknowledge the financial and technical support of the National Emergency Management Agency, who support us to bring this resource to you. The next AIDR webinar will be next week on World Tsunami Awareness Day, and we'll be showcasing and launching the new Tsunami Emergency Planning in Australia handbook on the 5th of November. So you can register for that one there on the screen. And then in the following week, our next Resilience Matters webinar will be with Mark Crosweller on the ethical premise of disaster management leadership. So looking at that kind of whole idea of values and values-based decision making in risk reduction and resilience. When you leave this call, this webinar, you'll be taken to a short survey. We use this information to help ensure that our events are meeting your needs. So if you've got the time, please complete the survey and let us know what you think. On behalf of AIDR, thanks for joining us today. And it's certainly been my absolute pleasure to host you this afternoon. Until next time, stay well.